When a veteran police captain and a seasoned social worker both swear they saw a 9-year-old boy walk backward up a wall and onto the ceiling, you have to stop asking if ghosts are real and start asking what happened in that house on Carolina Street to make the laws of physics simply stop working. It was a standard rental house in Gary, Indiana, the kind of place you drive past 1,000 times without a second thought. But for LaToya Ammons and her 3 children, it became a localized center of gravity for something that defies every rational explanation we have. We often hear these stories from people who might be seeking attention or struggling with mental health, but this case is different because the people documenting the nightmare weren't just the family. They were the very institutions we rely on for objective truth, including the Gary Police Department, the Department of Child Services, and medical staff at local hospitals. It all started in the spring of 2012 with a swarm of black flies that invaded their porch, which sounds like a simple infestation until you realize it was the dead of winter, and no matter how many times they killed them or how much poison they sprayed, the flies kept coming back in hundreds, clustered against the screen like they were trying to get to something inside. But the flies were just the heralds of a much deeper rot because soon the house itself began to breathe, or at least that's how LaToya described the heavy, rhythmic thumping that started coming from the basement stairs and the kitchen floor when no one was there. You might think it was just an old house settling, but then the shadows started moving independently of the light, appearing as silhouettes of a large man pacing the living room, leaving wet footprints on the floor even when the pipes were bone dry. LaToya's mother, Rosa Campbell, was there too, and she remembers the night things shifted from creepy to dangerous when she felt an invisible force pin her to the bed, a weight so heavy she couldn't scream, while a voice that wasn't human told her she would never leave that house alive. Therefore, the family turned to their church, seeking protection through prayer and oil, but the presence in the house seemed to feed on their fear rather than be repelled by their faith. This brings us to the first moment where the world outside that house had to take notice, because LaToya's 12-year-old daughter was found unconscious, hovering just above her bed in the middle of the night, and when she woke up, she had no memory of how she got there or why her siblings were screaming. Now imagine you are a social worker like Valerie Washington, someone trained to look for signs of abuse or neglect, entering a home expecting to find a typical case of a family in crisis. But instead, you find yourself in a room where the air feels like it's vibrating with malice. During an intake interview at a medical clinic, Washington and a registered nurse witnessed the youngest son, only 9 years old, begin to growl at his mother with his eyes rolled back into his head. But the moment that changed everything, the moment that made this case a matter of official record, was when that same boy stood up, looked at the wall, and began to walk backward up it, defying gravity entirely as he moved toward the ceiling before flipping over and landing on his feet. You have to understand that this wasn't a dark room or a shaky camera moment. This happened in a bright clinical setting under the observation of state employees who were there specifically to debunk any claims of the supernatural. Therefore, Valerie Washington had to write an official report for the Department of Child Services stating that she had witnessed an unexplained event, a phrase that is almost never used in government paperwork because it admits a complete loss of control over the situation. But the skepticism didn't just vanish because the police were called in, led by Captain Charles Austin, a man with decades of experience on the force who had seen the worst of humanity and had no time for ghost stories. When Austin first arrived at the house, he was convinced he was looking for a rational explanation, perhaps some kind of mass hysteria or a clever hoax designed to get the family out of their lease. However, his skepticism hit a wall when he began to experience the house for himself, noting that his car radio began to malfunction only when he pulled into the driveway, and his police-issued equipment started acting sporadically. During a search of the basement, Austin took photos of the crawlspace, and when he looked at them later, the images were blurred by misty shapes that weren't visible to the naked eye, including one photo that appeared to show the face of a silhouetted figure watching them from the corner. It's like trying to listen to a radio station where the signal is mostly static, but every few seconds, a voice cuts through with perfect clarity, saying something so terrifying that you wish you were back in the noise. This is the analogy for the Ammons' lives during those months, a constant hum of dread punctuated by sharp, violent outbursts of the impossible. But the involvement of the church added another layer of complexity, because Father Michael Maginot was brought in to perform a formal assessment for an exorcism, a process the Catholic Church takes incredibly seriously and rarely authorizes. Maginot interviewed the family for hours, looking for signs of mental illness or pious fraud, which is when someone fakes a possession to feel special or holy. But what he found was a family that was genuinely terrified and children who were exhibiting what the church calls extraordinary demonic activity, including speaking in languages they had never learned and showing strength that should have been physically impossible for their size. So the priest began a series of 3 major exorcisms, sessions that lasted for hours where the air in the room would suddenly turn ice cold despite the Indiana summer heat. During these rites, Latoya would transition from a soft-spoken mother to something that spoke with a guttural, multi-toned voice, mocking the priest's Latin and revealing secrets about the people in the room that she couldn't possibly have known. But the most chilling part of the police investigation wasn't the shadows or the voices. It was the physical evidence found buried under the floorboards of the basement. When officers dug into the dirt of the crawlspace, they found a strange collection of items including a heavy metal weights, a small container of hair, and fingernail clippings, all of which pointed towards some kind of ritualistic activity that might have occurred in the house long before the Ammons family ever moved in. Therefore, the theory shifted from a haunting to a deliberate opening of a door, a portal as the local media began to call it, though that word feels too much like science fiction for the gritty reality of what was happening. We have to consider the perspective of the landlord, who was understandably frustrated by the media circus and the damage to the property, claiming that the family was just trying to avoid paying rent. But then you have to ask yourself, would a family really go so far as to subject their children to invasive medical psychological exams, risk losing custody to the state, and invite the police to dig up their basement just to save a few $100s on a security deposit? It doesn't add up, especially when you factor in the testimony of Dr. Jeffrey Oniuni, the family's physician, who admitted that he saw things in his office that he could not explain through any known medical or psychological framework. He described the children as being acted upon by an outside force, a conclusion that a man of science does not reach lightly. But even after the exorcisms were completed and the family eventually moved to Indianapolis to start a new life, the house on Carolina Street remained a dark stain on the neighborhood. It was eventually purchased by Zach Baggins, a well-known paranormal investigator who wanted to preserve it for study, but even he ended up demolishing the structure because he claimed the energy inside was too volatile and dangerous to remain standing. But before the house was torn down, more strange occurrences were documented, including voices caught on recorders in an empty building and workers refusing to enter certain rooms because they felt a physical pressure on their chests. This case forces us into a corner where we have to choose between believing that a massive group of professional adults, police, nurses, social workers, and priests, all suffered from the same specific hallucination at the same time, or that there are pockets of this world where the rules we live by simply don't apply. It's like a glitch in the software of reality that happened in a small town in Indiana, and the deeper you dig into the official records, the more the logical explanations start to feel like the actual fantasy. The Department of Child Services eventually closed the case, noting that the children's behavior improved significantly after they left the house and the religious interventions were performed, which is a very polite way of saying the demons were gone. But if you talk to the people who were there, the officers who still don't like to talk about what they saw in those photos, or the medical staff who watched a boy climb a wall, you realize that for them, the case is never truly closed. It remains a haunting reminder that our understanding of the world is built on a very thin crust of normalcy, and underneath that crust, there are things that growl in the dark and walk where they shouldn't. The Ammons case stands as one of the most heavily documented instances of the supernatural in modern American history, not because of the claims themselves, but because of the credibility of the people who were forced to witness them. But even now, years later, there is a sense that we only saw the surface of what was happening in that basement, and that some questions were left unanswered because the answers were too heavy for any of us to carry.